Moon Crystal is a Famicom game developed by Hecht, otherwise known as Hector, in 1992. And no, we're not talking about the Breaking Bad villain. It's a rather lesser known company, which they were founded by a man named Masayuki Seki. The company was active until 1986 to all the way up to 2000 in the midst of PlayStation era. Their noteworthy titles includes with the likes of porting City Connection, Formation Z with the Famicom, as well as an absolute hit, American Daitorio Senkyo, aka a game that is based on United States presidential election.
I said, yep, what a concept.
Now, within this very low-profile company in general, Moon Crystal, despite ironically being already an obscure Famicom game on its own, it still stands out the most as it was one of their only side-scrolling platformer they've ever developed and published on the Famicom. And keep in mind, knowing the technical limitation for Famicom's hardware, it was an impressive looking game they pulled it off as well. Having said that though, it's also as expected to be one of those games where it still proves the limited supplies equals to the higher demands. It's probably the most rarest Famicom game out there. So rare to the point that just last year, apart from 3 copies with insane price tag, the only search result that I got was Sailor Moon instead. Yeah. Seriously, there were only about handful of listings on each auction site like eBay's or Yahoo Auctions, so on and so forth, and each time they would go above for 500 to 600 even just for the loose copy alone. That's almost, or maybe seems even more less than games like Gimmick on the Famicom, which on its own is already rare. While both games are expensive to the point where you might need to sell one of your arms, Gimmick at the very least seemed to pop up quite a bit because of strong cult following. That's not to say this game didn't have its cult following over the time. Other YouTubers like Healthy Video Game Nerd also made an extensive review on this game as well, which by the way I highly recommend you all check his review later on, as well as many other people complimenting with the overall game style. Beyond that though, again, it's one of those titles that you probably need to sell your mortgage. All kidding aside though, I'm not here to brag about having this expensive game in my possession, but rather it got me thinking while especially spending time with this game over the past few weeks or so, what makes this game so desirable?
Where is the money?
Is it such a great game to the point where is it even worth the asking prices that's been floating around these days? Of course, obviously, no one's willing to spend nearly half a 1K on just for the single retro game cartridge. I mean, hey, who doesn't want something cheaper? But at the same time, we do have a couple of hardcore collectors who granted wanted in a cheaper and affordable deals, but also would consider pay for the current asking price because for certain consumers, for them, they might be able to afford it and it might worth it for them for the asking prices that's floating around on the internet. Hence, why we are referring to it as a holy grail titles among these games. I will admit, I do own a couple of more desirable, so quote-unquote, holy grail titles of the later releases of certain Famicom and NES games over the span of my growing collection. Allow me to explain. For instance, I do have a copy of Snow Brothers, Seirei Dentetsu Rikuru, aka Little Samson, and DuckTales 2, which by the way, even for the Famicom version, it's not as expensive as the NES version. Snow Brothers, I had a personal childhood memory attached to it, and it was cheap for the pirated copy. Lickle was a game I technically grew up within my teenager year at this point, and my pirated copy was cheap. DuckTales 2 wise, well, it's a good bonus that came in a multi-card. Oh, and guess what? It was cheap. What I want to say is for a while, I would get certain games that I had a personal attachment in one way or another, or if it comes with the benefits of saving cost. Cause for instance, in DuckTales 2 case, I don't have too much of a personal attachment, but getting on a multi-card with the other games was cost efficient, and plus it made me to grow on me as the game itself gave me the appreciation with the quality of the game overall. Hence why, if it has both the good value and possibilities that I could appreciate the game more, those are the exceptions as to when I would pick up certain of these desirable titles. Like, I'm not the type where I would purposely seeking for the rare titles like, for example, Flintstone Surprise and Dinosaur Peak in any way, even knowing the fact that pirated copies are a lot cheaper, but the game is simply not on my alley, as much as anyone else might genuinely enjoy it. Hence why it will be more beneficial for other players to snatch the copy for themselves. That said though, very rarely I come across with the situation like this game. Moon Crystal to me is a unique for several reasons. Exhibit A, did not expect it to add into my collection. Exhibit B, never had a super strong interest in the past. And C, it just so happens to be a damn rare title on the Famicom that many would seek out for. I was first introduced with this game through our good old hardcoregaming101.net article, as well as seeing only a handful of gaming footages up from the internet. This was around 8 years ago, and well, I quickly forgot about it ever since. My initial and only response with the game was, oh, wow, that's a cool Prince of Persia animation style of platformer. But that was it. I completely forgot about it. Seriously, not even on a curiosity level where I wouldn't even try it on the emulator or even a flashcard for whatever reason was. And so I continued on with my life until the end of last year, where I accidentally stumbled across with this game on a pirated cartridge from the 90s. It was through the bundle of other games that I wanted to add it into my near end of my Famicom collection, and quite cheaply I might add too. Pleasant surprise. So I always wanted to ask, should the price be justified because simply they are on low on demand, or should it rather remembered with simply because it's an honest hidden gem where people would go after for certain of these NES and Famicom games? 3 previous titles I've mentioned before, despite with its rare status, it's also equally a good game on their own right, a hidden gem in some ways or another. Whereas there's also a case like Color a Dinosaur, Little Red Hood, or Action 52, notorious with the low quality standard of the game, to the point where you may be asking, are these worth paying more than 3-digit number? So by the end of the day, I would like to know the answer. How should this game be remembered as truthfully and critically from my perspective? So, without further ado,
Do it.
the main protagonist of the game is Rick Slater, a green-haired boy set in a journey to fight against Count Crimson, who kidnapped his family and villager with the stolen, well, Moon Crystal, which has a power to amplify the human energy, and Crimson is looking for something evil. And it's up for Rick to save his family and abducted villagers once and for all. On its first glance, the presentation of the game and its environment, for the Famicom's early 90s era, it looks beautiful to be true to be a Famicom game. The environment and the characters are super detailed, and each stage has its own characteristic, ranging from vibrant, colorful environment to darker, greedier environments. It has that distinctive fairy tale style, something out of Peter Pan or Robin Hood. I mean, literally, Pirate Ship alone really screams Peter Pan and actually does a better job than Hook on the NES. But within this somewhat innocent nature, the game also presents a little bit more darker tone, both with the environment of each stage, as well as the storyline that progresses throughout in this Ninja Gaiden style of cutscene, which we will get into in a bit. I mentioned hardcoregaming101.net before, where I was first introduced with this game, but there was one quote that stood out from this article was being compared with other media, and visually it's partially inspired with those of Ghibli studio films of great Hayao Miyazaki. In many ways, I can see the point from the article. Within the medieval European fairy tale fantasy style of environment, I can see a comparison with the likes of Howl's Moving Castle. Though, if we were to compare this game with Ghibli films that came out the same year as this game or prior, there's a bit of Porco Rosso, and robotic semi-cyborg theme really goes along with Laputa Castle in the Sky, and a bit of Nausicaa with certain fantasy creatures. In equivalent to the other Famicom game style, the closest comparison that people would often have is Zelda 2: The Adventures of Link, but minus the awkward overhead map stage. I mentioned it earlier about the in-game Ninja Gaiden style of cinematic cutscene, and well, I gotta say, it's one of the driving forces of this game, and one of the major highlights too. It's a heavy, story-driven, and almost kind of feels like you're watching a mini TV movie. This game was released way after Ninja Gaiden, so it's nothing new to have this cinematic cutscenes included in a Famicom game. But it's certainly one factor that drives you to play this game fully through. Coming back to the game itself, the music is also something noteworthy to touch upon. Once again, it has that very medieval musical soundtrack to begin with, and each stage represents well with its environment, from the range of upbeat, adventurous music to the more ambient, slightly darker tonality of the soundtracks. To more tense soundtrack like a boss battle. Going back with the graphics, the character animation is something to be noteworthy for, and it looks smooth. Main character Rick alone has at least more than 4 frames per each movement. Everyone, including your common stage enemies, are all animated in such detail, almost very similar in art style of Prince of Persia or Out of This World. And again, for a Famicom game, it's quite impressive that they could pull these off. That being said, however, there's an ultimate caveat with having more frames per movement. After all, there's always gonna be a give and take situation. And this is where I'll be critical a bit more, harder and harsher, and that is none other than effects on the controls. From the get-go, the basic movement itself is not the main issue. In fact, it's standard. A for jumping, B for using your short-range attack dagger. Not to mention, you also have a ducking and duck swinging dagger movement, which is always a good plus to have an attack move while ducking. For the most part, the controls are fairly responsive, but to be able to pull a quick movement, however, is a completely different story. Simply because a main flaw of control delays from behalf of the animation of frames itself. This single aspect became one of the major annoyance to me, especially when you need to act quickly, like turning yourself around. Same thing goes with ducking, especially if there's a flying object coming by, like these flying daggers in the pirate ship stage for instance. You are bound to get hit simply because of the delays. Given with the true similarity with the likes of Prince of Persia, there's even a climbing on edge ability, which is a skill you gotta get used to it, but at times you gotta be precise with the climbing on the edge, as at times it will make Rick to drop off from the platform again. It can get on your nerves really quickly, especially if you're in a hurry. You gotta be precise with every movement. Your standard weapon with the dagger you keep is a short range attack. Though with timing it just right, it does its job to defeat most of the enemies precisely. But that said though, because of the somewhat awkward hitboxes, it may also take some time to get used to it with slashing certain enemies on perfect timing. In addition, talking about the hitboxes, there seems to be a weird thing where if you get hit, you immediately get knocked by or occasionally sucked into the enemies. Like the boss battle, for example, in particular, which on top of the delayed controls with turning yourself around, this can be very frustrating at times. Thankfully, the game does provide you with certain items throughout the stages. There's an extended dagger, which gives you more range to target the enemies, as well as Crystal itself, where it gives you the brief invincibility period, which is always nice. By far the essential item out of all is the double jumping shoes, a flying shoes I might add, which allows you to do the double jump in mid-air, easily a must-have item as you progress through the stage. But once again, you should also be aware when to initiate the double jump. Since the shoes for the most part it works, but on a certain spot where it seemed like the double jump input doesn't seem to work. Also, no matter what you do be careful when you pull the dagger move whilst you're doing double jump in mid-air, since at times when the enemies are closer to the edge, trying to pull the dagger move while jumping, it locks Rick for a couple of seconds. Not to mention, on certain stages like this, where I'm trying to kill this mid-air enemy, there's this weird ceiling glitch where it doesn't allow you to pull the dagger if you hit the top of the head, leading you to the frustrating damage or death. One thing I also can't forgive is each time you complete the stage, the game takes away all of your items and health. It will always start fresh with the items and health, so you better hope to regain all those items back again as soon as possible. And look, I get that it's a short game, which they resort it with the difficulty being the factor to play a game even longer, and a lot of games does this. Thankfully, stage-wise, it's one of those games that gives a gradual difficulty with learning curve, which doesn't throw off the players immediately from the start. Not to mention, to credit for what it's due, despite with its rising difficulty, with the inclusion of the different stage themes, it does a good job with occasional varieties of the stage. Quite a fun challenge given with the amount of skills that you gotta take used to it as you progress through the game. It's a self-grow in many ways, like playing a sports, for example. But certain stages, the enemy placement can be, again, annoying. The third stage is where I had a bit of trouble in the beginning, where you have to activate these switches to open up the gates. But that's not all, you also have to pass through the gate on time, or else the gate closes on you. But that's still not all. Since you have to defeat certain enemies with the short-range dagger attack, it's best not to get hit because you become handicapped for a bit. So it's best for everything has to be precise, which can be your biggest anxiety playing through this game. Furthermore, even after you defeat the enemies, there's your classic enemy respawn as well, so that means it's another blow for you to rush through the stage. Literally, if you were to leave the screen just by a tiny fraction of inch, the enemy still comes back to life. So again, giving that unfair damages. And did I mention the backwards hit detection? Well, there's plenty of stages where if you get hit, if there's a convenient pit behind, well, it's a yet another convenient death blow down below. In fairness though, even other good games are like this, and also it's not as bad as Castlevania series. The boss battles are also pretty tough going, albeit it could be a lot easier than the standard stages. Each boss have their own pattern to go through, and if you were to be patient, it's a bit easier to go through. My strategy is that you get used to with the jump, hit, and turn practice, where it allows you to rotate yourself a lot quicker while jumping in mid-air. If you do get the hang of it time to time, you can easily get the pattern right for the boss battles. It could be easier over time. At least, that is until you reach the final level. Once Ricky unites with his mother and the villagers, she informs Ricky's sister Merle and his father is taken by Count's laboratory, and it's off for the epic showdown with Rick and Count. The final stage really puts you on the test, with plenty of pits, demolishing platforms, enemies, and of course the dreadful spikes. And some parts of these stages, which I swear there's no way I can not take a hit. There's even this segment where you have to hang on to the edge of this moving platform while simultaneously walk onto the falling platform. And just to avoid a big middle finger from the game, whatever you do, do not ever double jump with shoes, or otherwise it's your doomsday down after getting hit by spikes. Once Ricky encounters Count, capturing his sister Merle, it goes with several battles between two forms of Count's scientist assistant, which the first form is pretty tough with trying to battle this robot knight looking formation. But the second form, once the hood takes up, it's pretty easier. All you have to do is make sure to double jump and slash on the assistant's face each time he jumps with the robot. Count regardless tries to use Merle as a science experiment.
Oh, you've got to be shitting me.
Only to be stopped by Rosina, and spoiler alert, turns out, according to Count, his daughter, Rosina, passed away a long time ago, and Rosina that everyone is seeing now is a simulation through the moon crystal, which is the only reason how Rosina is still alive. You know, I gotta say, for the Famicom title, the theme of grieving for the lost ones is actually quite dark for its time. And I have to say, despite this was released in the era where most mature content wasn't really the thing, this game embraces it through with the storyline, and it's pretty shocking if you ask me. Count runs off again to the top, where Rick has to chase one last time until he reaches to the top, where Count doesn't even need Merle to be experimented anymore. He shows the full moon reflection on the crystal, where Count transforms into a monster. At this point, I won't even comment on the fact that this is a Famicom game we're talking about. This is pretty awesome. But oh boy, if it isn't the most unforgiving monster ever.
Dude, what the
Count as a monster, and the final battle has two forms once again. The first form that looks like a hybrid of Godzilla and Stranger Things monster is already difficult trying to avoid Count's projectiles from his mouth beams and his own version of Hadouken from Street Fighter 2. On top of that, his projectiles from mouth bounces twice, so you gotta make sure to stay extra focused and you will be fighting with your thumb quite a lot, rocking your D-pad, as delays will kill figuratively and metaphorically in this game, that is. But brace yourself, when you beat the first form is where you probably don't even want to blink your eyes. Now he crouches back. Are we in Junji Itoi's horror territory now? Well, anyway, this time the fire slides across the floor, and on top of that, the projectile that Count spits out from his mouth follows you around. Every movement that Rick makes, and you have no idea how difficulty went from 0 to 100 real fast. So much so, I kid you not, the boss was so intense to the point where the game crashed itself. You can't make this shit up. But once you beat it though, man, doesn't that feel refreshing in victory? Though that quickly goes up because you also get to see a tragic farewell from Rosina as the lab and the lunar system gets falling apart. She remains behind since Crystal itself was the only thing that kept her alive at this point. Now that is one of the dark, tragic ending for the Famicom game. And it's honestly the story for once that drives this game through and makes it worthwhile playing. But that's not the end afterwards. Afterwards, Rick has to escape Count's lab in about a minute or so, which is equally intense as the boss fight itself, as everything collapsing down in this epic final showdown. Once you successfully escape, that is where Moon Crystal comes to peace. The end of an epic journey for Rick. The town is saved and everything came back to normal. Ending with the moral of the story, just like Spider-Man, with great power comes with great responsibilities, and never to abuse the power of Moon Crystal again. And just like that, Moon Crystal sinks down with the mine together. While spending some time with Moon Crystal and studying for its appeal, both pros and cons, there are many factors to categorize with how it appeals the players and audiences. In one way or another, impressiveness is one way to put it by 100%, especially in terms of technical aspect of the game that this game is going for within the graphics and animation style, which is something I can give a huge plus for the game within the art style. But the perfect NES platformer though, well, to me, dare I say, not quite. At least I wouldn't put it on my top 10 of the action platformers in the lines of like Contra, Lickle, Mario 3, and quite frankly, even the most difficult games of all time like Ninja Gaiden. It certainly has its own flaws, quite frustrating one I might add at times. With delayed controls for certain moves, even though you get used to it over time, it can be quite aggravating for certain stages. Having said that though, there's certainly a charm with the overall experiences. It stands out quite a lot from Rare or even just any common daily NES platformers in general, in a way where it's different approach to appeal to players, where it drives them into the environment that is presented in the game. It's not your usual cheery bright platformers simply aimed for kids, which the console was demographic for. And its presentation feels greedier and in many cases quite epic cinematic too. If you were to understand the language fully or to be able to get the translation version of the storyline, it makes you to invest into the story. A major driving force where it wants you to continue playing the game on its own right, to see the progress till the end. And quite frankly, it's an epic tale of Rick overall. On top of that, uniquely presented wonders of medieval fantasy world with a bit of a cyberpunk aspect and a bit of an alien-inspired horror creature elements. Added together, these different elements blend in pretty well together, combining with a bit of learning curve. While again, it may have its frustrating elements and dilemmas, it does have its highlighted moments within the gameplay. By the end of the day, while compiling this review together and to truly reflect my experience with the game, well, there certainly were the moments it boiled my blood. I can't lie to you, as much as I understand and up for the increasing difficulties and challenges, but I would have enjoyed it a lot more given the fact that there are a couple of minor issues I mentioned before could have been slightly more polished. That said though, I can also say it with my full confidence that I enjoyed the overall game and its own unique charm and experiences with the gameplay. So to put it simply, if I were to make my verdict as to how this game should be remembered, whether being just for the expensive trophy piece of an expensive title, or simply a greatest masterpiece ever lived, even surpassing other platform action games, I'd rather put it in this way. It's a game where it should have been remembered as an interesting piece of title that stands out with its own appeal they're trying to go for with the audiences. It might not be a perfection of the game, but it certainly stands out for being different and stands out for giving its own voice in many different ways. Over time, the game could be a lot more appreciated, more and by many. But until then, Moon Crystal is just yet another unique history in the NES library.